It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 543, and it's May the 2nd, 1982. I have been talking the last 3 weeks about the Falkland Islands and the Antarctica connections to Argentina and the importance of Antarctica to world affairs. This is an area that's been long ignored by persons in teaching geography, teaching history. It's up to us to find it for ourselves, but I have reason to believe that Antarctica is much more important than we were even directed to find. Oh, here, Matthew, are we on now?
You're on.
Should I start over?
No, you're okay.
Keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we better start over just in case and say it's Mae Brussell, broadcast number 543, May the 2nd, 1982, just in case it didn't get on the tape. Regarding the Falkland Islands, the Argentine conflict with Great Britain, the last 3 weeks I've been going into Antarctica and the importance of Antarctica in terms of history, of what's down there, of what has been linking the possible Nazi connections, the UFO connections, the space stations, what is going on in Antarctica. And some articles in the New York Times and a few other articles, very few, have brought out the importance of Antarctica to the Falkland Islands and to Argentina. But this is an area that, as I just briefly said before, if we were on or off the air, I'm not sure at that time, we were never taught in geography classes what was going on in Antarctica. And while there's a lot of literature out about the area, I have never really pursued it or looked for very much in the many articles that have been published, except that I do take a bulletin from the government on Antarctica development and do cut out articles from time to time. And this week I went into depth into 3 articles that were in the National Geographic that I outlined on this particular area to see what I had missed in the past, to go back and just look at some of the things that are happening down in there, because I do think it has a lot to do with controlling the entire area. What Argentina would have if they would get Great Britain out of the area, what they would be controlling in terms of not only oil and mineral and resources, but what else is going down there. Now, the March 1964 National Geographic had a section on Operation Deep Freeze that began in 1963. That was the year that John Kennedy was assassinated. That was quite a long time ago. And they used those controversial Lockheed C-130s to take large staffs of people down to Antarctica. The C-130s came into the news recently with regards to the Western Airline and Neil Byrd and the delivery of C-130s, these huge transports to Gaddafi, that the government had stopped the shipment, that we had held them up in Atlanta, Georgia, and didn't want Gaddafi to have these huge planes. But what I didn't realize was that in 1963 and 1964, the United States had large C-130 transports that they were taking from Andrews Air Force Base, which is part of the Space Shuttle program, down to Cape Town in South Africa, and then down to Argentina. And that there were stations in Antarctica, 5 run by Great Britain at the time, 4 by Chile, and 3 by Argentina, and that these airplanes could fly 4,700 miles from Cape Town, South Africa, and they could carry 3,600 gallons of 3,600 gallons of gasoline, or 145,000 pounds of fuel for each plane. That the process for delivering large amounts of equipment was possible as far back as 1963, that Lockheed C-130s, those huge transport planes, and that they used them, according to the National Geographic, to take a lot of equipment down to Antarctica and also to study the stresses of hostile environment for possible use in space, which I read later in the New York Times just several weeks ago, the importance of Antarctica in terms of space laws, or how to manage space colonies, the laws that apply to Antarctica or to space colonies, or colonies on the moon. But this goes way back. The development began a long time ago, and the technology for moving large amount of people and equipment began. And this one National Geographic article says that Antarctica will serve as a way station between South Africa and Australia. It was serving, this was early in 1963, and in 1962 we had begun to send the huge transports. And one of the first people to go down there with this operation of the C-130s was Lowell Thomas, who was a famous newscaster who was strongly identified and linked with the CIA. Another article I read about Antarctica that was even more interesting, the National Geographic, October 1968, was just a mind-boggler. And the title of that article that I had is Antarctica, the Icy Testing Ground for Space. And I looked at the issue, which I never was aware of before, of who was on the board of trustees of the National Geographic, because this particular article had such shocking information in it in terms of what is happening in other places around the world today. And on the board of directors was Lawrence Rockefeller, Juan Trippe, that's Trippe, who was chairman of Pan American World Airways, and that's the airline that was trying to get monopoly of all the routes to South America and down to this area. And they fly Navy planes down to Antarctica. This was in the National Geographic article. Their Pan Ams are available for the Navy to fly down there also. This last week, Eastern Airlines was given the route that Braniff had to stop the monopoly of Pan Am throughout entire South America. But Mr. Tripp was honorary chairman of the board of Pan Am World Airways, was part of National Geographic Society, and Earl Warren, the great Chief Justice of the United States in 1968. Now, Earl Warren headed the commission to investigate the murder of John Kennedy, and there were Nazis involved in Argentina that he covered up in his investigation purposely. He had information that he could have pursued down to Argentina of the links to Lee and Marina Oswald, and to Lee Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Walter Dornberger and the space program, the Wernher von Braun and the Nazis that were linked to Bell Helicopter Aerospace in Texas. Earl Warren had covered up the Nazi connections of those persons down in Argentina and in this area, including Wernher von Braun, who would travel down to Antarctica. He was a visitor down to see these space stations that he called future moon stations. Earl Warren was on the board of the National Geographic, and also Curtis LeMay, former chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force, and Mr. William Martin, Jr., chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. There was quite an interesting group, and James Webb of NASA, the administrator for NASA. And NASA, Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger were named in the Torbett document and in other information as one part of the five-prong group that were involved in the killing of John Kennedy. And the Rockefellers had given money and identification to George de Mohrenschildt when he was suspected of being a Nazi war criminal. He was Lee Harvey Oswald's close associate. So on the board of National Geographic, with the activities going down in Antarctica, a lot of activity. There was Lawrence Rockefeller and Mr. Tripp from Pan Am, Earl Warren, James Webb from NASA, and Curtis LeMay, and the head of the Federal Reserve System. Now, this one article says that over the past 75 years of National Geographic, and this was dated 1968, up to 1968, they had more than 70 articles on Antarctica, and I was never aware myself that there was such a large amount of information accumulated about this particular area and what was going on. And they said that men now live and work at the South Pole. They have for dozens of years, and there's at least 40 scientific outposts. Now, this was in 1968, that there were 4 stations there and outposts going on all the time down at the South Pole. This article also said that they had a nuclear power station in Antarctica. And I mentioned several weeks ago the possibility and references of the man-made UFOs coming out of the Antarctic area in the South Pole linked to the Argentine military regime and the Nazis in South America. This one National Geographic in 1968 said they had a nuclear power station. They had a nickname for it called, well, it's so ridiculous, it was called Nuki Poo. Okay, that's their nuclear power station, that they generate electricity from atomic heat, and they distill fresh water from the sea for a settlement of 1,000 men in the summer and 200 during the fierce winter at this one station. Now, National Geographic, with a long list of scientists on the board, in addition to these other people, is saying that they distill fresh water from the sea. And I'm wondering about droughts in Biafra or Nigeria, Liberia, Kenya, Ethiopia, with masses of starving people, huge masses of humanity that you've seen on television, on World Vision, and I've done programs on this before, being allowed to die because the area is dried up, there's drought, there's no food, and large groups of Christian organizations coming in and teaching them that if they turn to Christianity, God will save them. And huge masses of people, 10 to 20 million, dying every year from drought and lack of water. And how is it possible that they are desalting water for people living down in Antarctica? Either I'm not reading this correctly, or there's something going on that most of us are not aware of. And I really believe that that is the truth, because I know at the end of World War II, the Germans had sulfa medicines and prescriptions that the United States didn't get for a long history of years. And there's certain countries that have cures for conditions and health situations that this country doesn't have, and we prolong illnesses where other cures are available in other places. Now, if there is atomic energy down there, and if there is fresh water from the desalting, then the droughts and the genocide that's going on of the large masses of population has to be purposeful, because if you can provide the technology from the tip of the ocean down at the South Pole, you could be doing the same thing around Africa or Central America or wherever there's droughts. So this one particular issue in 1968, October 68, talks about desalting water, and that's how they live down there. This article also talks about biologists from the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech and how they study psychology and how men would live under stress and cramped into isolated spaces for future space stations and colonies up in space and moon colonies. Well, the people like Jacques Vallée have said that the UFOs are man-made, and the sightings predominantly are coming out of the Antarctic area. And it seems that there is this tremendous technology that many of us might have overlooked, if you can believe National Geographic and their sources. And again, this 1968 issue has a picture of those huge airplanes, the C-130 Hercules, coming in and supplying laboratories. And it says they built large roads and this construction work, and it goes into the use of bringing equipment to Antarctica and the South Pole by the Lockheed C-130s. And there evidently is a lot more building than we know is going on, and it describes the building and the road construction and the housing and the open water that's available. And there's a picture of dry areas similar to the mesa in Arizona that many of us don't associate with the South Pole. This same article says the Navy chartered Pan American Airlines down there as early as 1957 down to Antarctica. Remember, there was a disproportionate amount of bodies at Jonestown. It jumped from 420 or so up to 912. And I believe that they were being experimented upon in Venezuela or other areas in South America and were then flown in. They decayed at a different rate. And with these huge transports and with the intent to study people under stress, and psychologists and scientists working on sleep behavior, dreaming, cramped behaviors, isolated conditions, future space stations. October 1968 of this National Geographic shows pictures of people being experimented, adults. Evidently, they're giving permission, but goodness knows what else you can do in an area the size of the United States and Mexico combined. We can't even keep track of what's going on in places like Vacaville, much less what's down at Antarctica or, say, the homes that Jim Jones had in this country. And that same issue shows an area in Antarctica. It says one of the strangest regions in Antarctica is the Scott Coast. Behind that area, there's the towering Royal Society Range. There's valleys that are ice-free, desert-like the mesa lands of the American Southwest. And it goes in, again, I described brown hills and clear water. It's at Wright Valley and several others like it, slope inland rather than to the sea. And there's the Onyx River, a stream that bubbles, and it seems to go up towards a Lake Vonda. And they tell about drinking water, icy water from the lake, and having a hot tub and refreshing themselves on a desert at Antarctica that doesn't have snow or ice at all. So that you get a different view when you read some of the back issues, which I started to do, of Antarctica. I don't have all 70 that they published up to 1968, but a few of them. And in terms of chronology, by 1968, according to this issue, travel to Antarctica is almost routine travel, like going to any distant land. In 1968, they started Operation Deep Freeze, which was supposed to be scientific research. In 1968, the C-130s had airlifts of scientists and the huge Hercules airplanes, and they made daily flights around areas, visiting different stations. And the same article refers to diesel bulldozers, huge tractors, trailer trucks, graded roads, cargo ships with icebreakers that came and went, and that they had, as I say, the use of nuclear power down there since 1963, and that they wanted to make a prototype for living future on the moon, and that in January 68, Wernher von Braun was there. He was there lots of times, but this just mentions one particular time, as well as biologists and physicists and psychologists studying people's reactions to living under these cramped conditions. So this has been a place of building. I knew that there was a lot of money going down constantly. I mentioned that on the program before. There's a lot of building, something that we can't even visualize how much there is. And it could be that Jacques Vallée's interpretation of where those UFOs came from could indeed come down from the same place as the atomic energy that could fuel those very UFOs that he says are man-made, that are seen all around the world, but particularly down in that area. Another National Geographic article in 1976, of June 76, tells about the National Foundation going down there in Antarctica in 1966. And it gives a little history of Admiral Byrd and his first exploration. And I talked several weeks ago on the secrecy of Admiral Byrd's papers of what he saw in 1946 and 47 that are locked up. But he went down there in 1933. This says Richard Byrd spent time down there in expedition. He was appointed honorary postmaster of Little America in 1928 to 1930. The National Geographic Society encouraged and helped finance Admiral Byrd to go down for his second expedition from 1933 to 1935. So 1928 to 1930, he was encouraged to go down to the South Pole. In 1933 to 35 was the next expedition. So when the National Geographic published a map in 1957 and again 1963 of an area that Hitler was anxious to have a German foothold in 1939, that doesn't sound so bizarre. Why wouldn't Adolf Hitler stake out a place from 1938 to 39 if Admiral Byrd is down there from 1933 to 35? The Americans were down there, the American military were down there, the scientists were there. So the Germans certainly kept up and were more advanced than us on many of the technologies for surviving down there, I'm sure. And they had the rockets and missiles that we brought to this country as soon as World War II was over, and brought the scientists, as many as we could, to the United States and to the space program. So Antarctic area, the South Pole, was not unknown to the Germans any more than Admiral Byrd, and it wasn't an isolated thing that they staked out this area and began to develop it with all the equipment and huge planes, which seems they've been doing all along. And as I said before, I think the interesting thing is how early the atomic energy was down there. We can't seem to get atomic energy going in this country at all. And our plants like the 3 Mile Island or down at San Luis Obispo or 30 other plants have been temporarily shelved or they're not working. What techniques do they have down there that have worked continuously? We haven't read about any leaks or any problems. And what way do they support themselves with water? Are they desalting themselves, the water, and drinking out of the same ocean that all of us assume can't be desalted yet? Maybe they have a technique they've used for 20 or 30 years that has not been shared with the rest of the world, which would be a good tool, a weapon, being able to sustain their own water system. Obviously, that's being done down there and nowhere else, it seems, in the world, or at least we're not told about it. Another friend sent me an article from National Geographic, April 1962, and it showed John Connally with Admiral Byrd. Connally was Secretary of the Navy, and he was active with the astronauts, of course. And on the stand, there's a picture of them, old comrades here. John Connally Jr., then Secretary of the Navy, praised Byrd's determination and sheer grit for going down to Antarctica. Well, John Connally worked, if you've read the Torba document, worked with an organization called Permindex that worked with NASA and Wernher von Braun, who was frequently down in Antarctica, and Walter Dornberger from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Dornberger lived in Texas when John Connally left the Navy and became the governor of Texas. And they were both involved in the planning and the cover-up, at least the cover-up, of the murder of John Kennedy. And I believe Dornberger had an even more insidious role, he and Wernher von Braun, in that particular assassination. But their National Geographic has not only Earl Warren on the board of directors and works closely with NASA and von Braun, but John Connally is giving accolades to Admiral Byrd, and Byrd had come home and kept secret his relationship to what he saw down there on his military mission. That is really the answer to the future of the Falklands or the British-Argentine struggle, is how much is going on down there and what are we not being told about the area. That is the bottom line, and I can't begin to guess which way the Falkland affairs will come out, because it seems that there's a lot of hidden history that has accumulated over the past 37 years that we are not yet privy to. They're just little bits and pieces. One of the examples is a document I've referred to on this program through the years. It came out of the National Archives. David Lifton got it for me. It was a correspondence between members of the Warren Commission back in 1964. That was a long way away. It was written by David Slauson to Mr. Rankin, Lee Rankin, of the Warren Commission, and it had to do with sending the Ziger family, their daughters, to Argentina. Argentina is where they came from, and their daddy ran the Minsk radio factory where Lee Harvey Oswald met Marina Oswald. The Zigers introduced the two of them, and the CIA wanted to send them down to Argentina while the Warren Commission was doing their work. That's what I mean about Earl Warren, and one of the examples of his covering up and bringing Argentina into that era that goes back to 1964. They made a note in their correspondence to the chief attorney of the Warren investigation, Mr. Rankin. It said at the end of this transcript, this was dated in 1964, and they're corresponding about investigating. They're supposed to be investigating a murder. June the 2nd, 1964, they wrote this. He said, the Zigers are living, the Russians sent a message out and smuggled it out to the relative of the Zigers who are living in the United States, and this message pleads for help to get their daughters out of Russia. And the theory is that the girls live in Argentina, and they would like to go back and claim their Argentine citizenship and get out of Minsk, because Leah and Marina are out there now. They've made the introduction. Their daddy was at the Minsk radio factory. And Isaac Don Levine, who's worked with the CIA and the Defense Department for years, suggested, according to this memo, that the American government, such as the CIA, should contact the Argentine government and get set the machinery in motion to bring the Ziger daughters back to Argentina. So what is going down in Argentina that we have a participant in the murder of a president, John Kennedy, and down there in that area with Earl Warren covering up this particular murder as the chief investigator, and the CIA being suggested sending them down to Argentina. We have a lot of tentacles down there in Argentina that have never really been exposed. If we had thoroughly investigated the murder of John Kennedy, we'd have a little better picture of what was going down in Argentina. Also, the book Were We Controlled, the important book on the Kennedy assassination, mentions the Bunch Corporation in Argentina, and I could do many programs on the links of that country and Antarctica and the South Pole to the Kennedy assassination, the interlocking people who have interest in that area. There was a news bulletin in 1975. CBS news correspondent Daniel Shore said he located a former CIA official who read a CIA memo about Lee Harvey Oswald. Shore interviewed the former agency employee on CBS Evening News. The former official stated he came across a memo in 1962, that's the year before Kennedy was murdered, which consisted of an interview report from a redefector from the Soviet Union. According to that official, the redefector described an ex-Marine who defected over to Russia, that was Oswald, who worked in a radio factory in Minsk and then came back to the United States with his wife in 1962. That was the exact account of Oswald's defection history. They said on CBS that the CIA memo dealt mainly with intelligence on the Minsk radio plant. And that, again, has to do with the manager of that and his family being brought back to Argentina by the CIA. CIA Director John McCone testified that the agency never had any contact at all with Oswald, but this memo suggests that they did through a Navy officer who also defected, and the Argentine connections are many. This is just one example of, and the Bunch Corporation down there, of that country to our CIA. And I've mentioned when this this conflict first came up, how important it is to know that Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Ronald Reagan are more pro-Argentine than they are British. And no matter what they say to Margaret Thatcher or what they say on the surface, their real appeal is to get England out of the area so that they can continue whatever it is they're doing. And we're not really sure how deep or how insidious this is going to go, but they've been involved in something very dangerous for a long, long time. The Liberty Lobby, many of you know what that is. That's put out by Willie Carto. He has an article, Falklands Are Valuable Real Estate. You better believe they are. And he's got a picture of Navy vessels and the Malvina Islands. He calls it the Malvina Islands and believes that it should go back to Argentina. This is a very particularly right-wing group who have been pro-Nazi on many, many points through the years, and they would like the Malvinas to belong to Argentina. They want the American CIA and the British out and to give that land down there, and that is very dangerous. There was an article this past week, it was in the newspaper, titled, Whoever Controls the Island Controls Sea Access to the Indian Ocean via the Cape of Good Hope. This was in the San Francisco Examiner last week. The Malvinas, strategic value to Argentina. Well, it's strategic to Argentina, and it's strategic to the United States, and all countries that would like access to the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific, the North Atlantic. Whoever controls the Malvinas, this article says, controls sea access to the Indian Ocean via the Cape of Good Hope, to the South Pacific via the Drake Passage, and even the North Atlantic. This is a very strategic area, and it is referred to by Associated Press as the Malvinas, not the Falklands. And there's a lot of pressure to give this power to the Argentine government, whoever they are. The pressure is to relinquish it and take it out of British hands without defining who they are down there, who are really running this, how many of them have unlimited money and power since World War II, and with no full description of what they really are capable of doing down there. It's a very dangerous place to play around because the oceans and free world may really be decided down in this little area. It's not a matter of 1,800 people or 2,000 sheep. There's something bigger that's been brewing for 30, 40 years down there, and I think it has to come to a head. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to some of the importance on the island in another minute. Now, referring to another article in the Monterey Herald last week by Alex Heibel. He was brought up, lived in Argentina, and teaches here at the Monterey Institute in the summer program. He has an article, The Falklands Invasion, Why Now? And he says the Argentine government opted for this invasion at this time because the Reagan administration gave the go-ahead. He implies that they really suggested that they could get away with it. He says Argentina's bargaining power in the United States increased very much when Ronald Reagan came to power, and it's of paramount importance that Reagan would give them anything. If he thought they were stopping the spread of communism, Reagan and Haig would give them anything. The funny thing was that as soon as Argentina began to take their power on the island and tell the British to go shove it, the Soviet Union lined up with Argentina. Here we have pursued this and encouraged them and have not figured out the role that the other nations will play in this big script as we flounder around as we did in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Libya. We've blown it in so many countries, our foreign policy, and we didn't even judge, what Argentina would do in their alignment with the Soviet Union while we encouraged them to go ahead and make this move. It's an interesting article in the New York Times. Haig aides see White House sniping in dispute over a plane. Another article in the New York Times, April the 14th, Haig needs a win badly, and it goes into his embarrassment of having various people from El Salvador testify, this fellow that came over, and then it turned out that he was forced to give his testimony under torture, and he changed his opinion, and the diagrams of installations that were built in Central America, and it turned out Somoza had built them. And this article is about Haig being pushed against the wall and almost embarrassed. Another Los Angeles Times article about our State Department last Thursday with Thomas O. Enders, the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, working on the Argentine problem. And I mentioned last week or the week before, Mr. Enders' wife, with the most wealthy woman from Argentina, entertained in Washington, D.C. the same day that the Argentines went into the Falklands. Haig working with Enders and the State Department, double dealing. One end they're socializing like Jeane Kirkpatrick, and the other they're pretending to be neutral. There's another article in the Washington Post, as Haig shuttles, irksome sideshows occur. And it shows Haig, and it's an article whittling away some of his credibility. And the article in Atlantic Monthly by Seymour Hersh, a section of a book, chewing out Haig with his wiretapping during the Watergate era and sneaking on people with Henry Kissinger. And another article in the Wall Street Journal about Mr. Haig trying to enhance his influence by excluding Reagan's chief domestic advisors, Mr. Baker, Meese, and Deaver, and trying to get control, and he can't dislodge them. And there have been a lot of articles on another one, Jack Anderson, Haig's humiliation. Well, it's very dangerous to poke at this man. He's dangerous if you leave him alone, and he's dangerous if you poke him because you don't know how far he's going to go or what he's doing under the table. The account that Seymour Hersh is writing about Kissinger and Haig is just a tiny bit of what went on in Nixon's White House or through the whole career of this man. I've mentioned it many times on the air. And there's a new book out by Ludlam called The Parsifal Mosaic, and there's some good reviews of this book because, in essence, he refers to a man who has an iron mentor, and that's the name used for Fritz Kramer, the fellow that is the genius behind, or genius or devil behind Fritz Kramer, behind Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. And in this Parsifal Mosaic, he has this Secretary of State who shouldn't have so much power. And Ludlum, the whole idea is that if you give him too much power, he could go crazy. And Robert Ludlum has this, it's a bestseller book, The Parsifal Mosaic, about the Secretary of State who has gone mad from the pressures of office and entered into insane schemes. And he's been used to start World War III. And in interviews, Ludlum said that he doesn't believe any man should have so much power. And he obviously is writing about a combination of Haig and Kissinger, and the Secretary of State who's gone mad from the pressures of office. And it seems with the shuttling and the knife stabbing in the back, the journalists in all the papers, the Washington Post and the New York Times and various papers, are stabbing at him and poking him, not that he doesn't deserve it, but this is a very dangerous man, and if he's pushed too far, we don't know where he'll go, and we always sit on the brink of World War III when these kinds of people take office. So while there's a good novel by Robert Ludlum on the dangers of this kind of a person, it's a tragic situation that after Watergate, with all the information we had, that we even allowed these people like Kissinger or Haig to continue the power they have and go back and forth because they're double dealers with their own staff and with other heads of states. This one review in the L.A. Times of the Parsifal Mosaic refers to the Iron Mentor, and that's the word that the Washington Post referred to Fritz Kramer behind Haig and Kissinger. And there's quite a few reviews of this book, different people's opinions of Parsifal Mosaic. I don't read very many or hardly any books of fiction because nonfiction is so interesting, but Robert Ludlum has written some very important books in terms of his seeming to know what's going on the inside and not liking it at all. And in interviews in private while he's promoting his book, he really fears the power of these people. And as I say, we don't know where they'll go, so that it's open-ended down there. One thing I know is that there's going to be a lot of heartaches in terms of resolving the confrontation, people taking sides and lining up against each other. But what we really don't know is how much more down there is concealed in terms of wealth, energy, arms, or buildings that have been kept secret from us up to this time. There's another article in the newspaper this last week, the Falklands could create a financial crisis. And that's along the lines that I have been trying to illustrate through the program for years, what I call the missing millions, the missing billions of loans, the floating money from Swiss banks, from South American banks, the transferring of billions of dollars out of this country down to South America for the provisions for what is taking place now, so that our banks are emptied out, but they have gold and cash, and they've been salting away money for the past 37 years and taking out loans, many countries, and they may have just used that money, not produced anything, but used it for a future war that they have had the intent of taking on since World War II. This article says, once again, the world's bankers are having nightmares from the major financial institutions in New York, London, and Paris, and Hong Kong. The reason, the Falkland crisis. It reminds us of the Iran crisis. And it goes into the fact that the powerful bankers threw money into Argentina. And the money went down to Buenos Aires, and banks from the Western Europe, United States, and Asia are left holding these debts. Argentina's total foreign debt is estimated at $32 billion. Well, there's 55 or 45 billion from Poland and another 23 billion from Romania and 32 billion from Argentina. Did all of these countries get that money and they can't pay it back? So they say, well, sorry. And the American taxpayer either has to come up with it or those banks go bankrupt. It says Argentina's total foreign debt is 32 billion. 21 billion is owed to banks in Britain and in 9 other nations. 9 billion to banks in the United States. 2 billion to creditors in Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bahamas, Panama, and so forth. The American banks holding most of the Argentine credits are Manufacturers Hanover, $1.1 billion, the Morgan Guaranty Trust, the Bankers Trust, the Chemical Bank, and the Citibank and Chase Manhattan. Well, why would Great Britain loan out $21 billion to Argentina if they are having a trouble matter with the Falklands all along, whether it's going to be the Malvinas or the Falklands? If they don't resolve these things, I really can't figure out how these international bankers loan these huge amounts of billions of dollars and get nothing returned for it, no collateral, nothing. And these particular countries are bankrupting the international bankers per se, which is something that Hitler liked to do. He attacked Wall Street or could attack certain bankers, meanwhile holding his banks intact and then getting his money out of Germany and putting it wherever he wants it to be for when the war is over, emptying it out. Now, these banks must be really stupid and foolish to lend out this kind of money, and all of a sudden they're left with a crisis, according to this particular article, Washington Bureau of the San Jose Mercury. They're left with a terrible situation that could cause panic, disarray, and cause many banks to close because of a foreign debt of $32 billion and $21 billion to Great Britain alone. I mentioned last week the Political Handbook of the World of 1975, and I just want to give you the reference. That was McGraw-Hill, published January the 1st, 1975, for political research done from the State University of New York at Binghamton for the Council of Foreign Relations. This is a large 700-page book, and when the book just starts out with Antarctica, first country, and then Argentina. In Argentina, it says second in size among the countries of South America. The Argentine Republic includes the national territory of Tierra del Fuego and also including the Falklands as well as portions of Antarctica. So that the Argentine government has portions of Antarctica and they control the Falklands, according to the Council of Foreign Relations in 1957. It didn't say that Falklands belongs to Great Britain. That was published a long time ago, and also part of Antarctica belongs to Argentina, and it'd be interesting to see which part. Now, the Los Angeles Times this week had an article, an update on the subject that I've brought up before, not far removed from that area of Argentina and down there, the appointment by Ronald Reagan of J. Peter Grace to what he has a new committee, what he describes as cutting down expenses of government to root out inefficiency and waste. And he appointed J. Peter Grace to be on this private sector survey on cost control. And there's been a controversy that has been firing up in some newspapers now. It was very quiet for a while. The associate of Mr. Grace is Dr. Otto Ambrose, convicted war criminal, Nazi war criminal. And the article in the Los Angeles Times says that they don't feel that there's anything wrong in employing Mr. Grace as a partner of Otto Ambrose. They've been partners for years because they said this is a technical position. And besides that, Mr. Otto Ambrose has served his own time, that he has paid his dues to society. This is that they said that Grace's associate paid his debt to society. They don't say how he paid it. They're both multimillionaires working for I.G. Farben, and it was Otto Ambrose who designed the gas for the concentration camps and also the slave labor. And Ambrose is described as a brilliant scientist who worked for the United States Department of Energy. Now, I knew that the Department of Energy was a dangerous place, and this Ambrose was supposed to die after the trials at Nuremberg. He survived. And last week I referred to an article I did in the Berkeley Barb in 1974, but I didn't mention to you that on page 2 of that article, when I was saying terror is official 8 years ago, I said that the genocide and the reduction of jobs and the closing in on minorities in this country would come from, in quotes, the energy crisis, that they would use the energy department. At that time, it seemed that this was going to be the cover for rounding up and controlling not only the wages, but turning people actually into slave labor And the insult of appointing Mr. Grace to this cabinet position has not been solved yet. There's a letter-writing campaign to Ronald Reagan. If you feel like writing letters, his staff so far says that they don't see anything wrong with it at all, and that the two partners from IG Farben, who worked close for 30 years, make a fine team. And really what Ronald Reagan's secretary, whoever answered the request so far in this matter, or the letters objecting to it, they said that they didn't see any problem at all, that Mr. Otto Ambrose has paid his debt to society, and that Mr. Grace and he can, I suppose, have a cabinet position for Ronald Reagan to decide how to cut money from our budget, and believe me, they'll know how to cut it. Now, as soon as J. Peter Grace was appointed to this position by Ronald Reagan, he got a special bonus from the Grace Company. That's, I guess, because he was finally recognized by the White House and put on a position of deciding, how to cut the federal budget to the bone while keeping the Defense Department and the chemical contracts sky high. He got $1 million bonus. The Wall Street Journal had an article April 19th that said J. Peter Grace, 68-year-old chairman, chief executive of W.R. Grace & Company, was paid an extra $1 million bonus, even though his salary ranges between $486,000 in 1981 and a little bit more with bonuses and fees of $62,000. He makes around $600,000 a year, but that wasn't enough for him. So in recognition for his accomplishments during his 36 years with Grace & Company as a business partner with Otto Ambrose, the man who designed the slave labor and the chemicals for extermination, as a bonus, they voted that he should have a $1 million present. So he's just been given a $1 million present, even though this fellow has a reputation with the Nazis from World War II right up to the present time. As now that Ronald Reagan's in office, he's valuable to the Grace Company more than ever. They said $486,000 a year is his salary, $62,000 in benefits, bonus, and $261,000 in benefits. So he had a salary of $809,000 and $1 million bonus, and he's going to cut the poor in this country right down to the bone. They really know how to put it on, I'll tell you. You've got to give these people credit for nerve. With that kind of salary, it seems that Ronald Reagan didn't appoint the right person to decide where to cut the budget. He should have taken somebody maybe who has $5,000 or $6,000 a year and see how they live. But that's not their style, and if they can get away with it, and they seem to get away with it, that's good, and more power to them. I guess you've got to really respect these people. They're so brazen in the way they go about things. Well, I was down in L.A. this week, and I picked up two good books, wonderful books, a rare picture of my personal project right now, and that project is Fritz Kramer. And I want you people who listen to the program, World Watchers, to collect books on World War II, particularly the Battle of Malmedy, where the Americans, about 10,000, were massacred. And I'm following the career of 4 Kraemers, and I'm going to detail them more maybe in the next week or two. I've done several broadcasts on them. But one Fritz Kramer worked for Adolf Hitler. He worked for Heinrich Himmler in the SS. He worked with Otto Skorzeny at that treacherous Battle of Malmedy where over 10,000 Americans were killed. And he was the genius behind that operation and Hitler's top spy. And I got a picture, a book, a pictorial history of the SS written by Andrew Mollo. The date was 1923 to 1945, the history of the SS, Hitler's SS. And in this book, there's a picture numbered 348, and it has 3 men at a trial in Germany. One is Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Division. A standing trial with 73 people, including the chief of the staff of this particular army group that killed so many Americans. Chief of Staff Fritz Kramer, the commander of this operation. On July 16th, 1943, the war was over in May of 43. The war was over in 45. On 16th of July, 43 people, not 1943, 43 prisoners were accused and sentenced to death for their role of murdering American soldiers at Malmedy, 43 of them. And Mr. Sepp Dietrich and Mr. Priest and Mr. Kramer are seen here in this book that I got. And Kramer doesn't have his number on. He's prisoner 33 at this trial, but he's just holding his nose in this particular picture. Then the book has an item under the picture, and it says this: thanks to the energetic effort of American Prosecution Counsel Major Everett, none of the controversial sentences were carried out. They were supposed to get 25, 18, and 10 years sentence for the murder of over 10,000 Americans in one little geographic area. 25, 18, and 10 years for the murder of the Americans. Thanks to the energetic effort of American Prosecution Counsel Major Everett, none of the people, there were 43 of them, none of the controversial sentences was ever carried out. And by 1956, the last of the group, from the Malmedy group, has been released from prison. They were in prison May 16th, 1946. That was a year after the war was over. Now, the reason I'm pursuing this is that I want to know if that Fritz Kramer again, the one in the docket, with Mr. Sepp Dietrich, and in this picture, another Mr. Press, P-R-I-E-S-S, are those people the same that worked with the CIA when the World War II was over? See, Dietrich worked with Senator Joe McCarthy, and Mr. Piper, who was also a German official, high-ranking German official. They were released from prison on the help of Senator Joe McCarthy, who in 1946 became a senator. His money was put up for the campaign by German Nazis in Wisconsin. Then he saw that these fellows were released from prison, and they were out right after their trial. Many were released immediately. But Mr. Fritz Kramer, whose picture, that rare picture of him, he's not in many history books, was released from prison. And a Fritz Kramer goes on to Washington to become that iron mentor that I've talked about behind Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Mr. Sonnenfeld and all the chief of staffs that are running this thing down in Argentina now, that we're also running the Vietnam War and Laos and Cambodia and arming Skorzeny's troops, sending 30 or 40 of them over to Egypt with the assistance of Skorzeny, who was at the battle down there at the Bulge along with them and with Himmler and Hitler. Skorzeny gets out, leaves prison, and he's arming Gaddafi and Nasser and Arafat and Sadat in the Middle East and turning them all into Nazi strongholds. And then they go from Madrid down to South America to Argentina, and they all have a continuous process of interrelationships with each other and with members of the United States Congress. Now, I believe, as I pursue this Fritz Kramer story with you, and I'll do it almost every week, a little piece of the puzzle, I believe that it's the biggest spy story in the United States. We hear about Kim Philby. He was the notorious head of British intelligence who then defected to the Soviet Union. But the counterpart were the Nazis that took over our Defense Department, the OSS when it became the CIA, the Pentagon, the Navy intelligence, who really took over the United States government. Instead of the communists taking it over, the Nazis took it over lock, stock, and barrel. And this Fritz Kramer, who's photographed in this particular book, is mentioned as having been released because the Americans dropped all sentences and let him out. And we don't know where he went after he left the docket of this particular trial at Dachau of May 46. I'm collecting as many books on the subject as I can afford to buy, and the others I'm photocopying from the library, the indexes, and I want to locate that Mr. Kramer. And in connection with the Fritz Kramer, for Hitler's Kramer and then the Kramer that works with Kissinger and Haig, the one that worked with Hitler and also the one that worked with Haig and Kissinger, I believe, is the same man whose brother was in London as a Nazi war criminal at the end of the war. There was a criminal in London who was kept with Walter Dornberger and the other top Nazis as soon as the war was over. And I'm trying to study many of the history books to get the links of these particular people to a Nazi base in Malmo, Sweden, that was directly connected to Himmler and to the OSS and Allen Dulles and London intelligence. What I believe is that we have 4 Kraemers, and 2 of them one worked for Germany and United States Army at the same time. The other worked in England and in Sweden at the same time, and they were brothers. So that instead of 4 different Kraemers, we have 2, and they were brothers, and they were serving the same master. Now, that's a kind of hard one to put together, but when I set my mind to find something, I'll stay with it for years if I have to, because I believe it is the answer to what is going to go on in the control of these oceans. You get these articles in the newspaper about the control of the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the development down on that area at the South Pole where we were led to believe, if we wanted to, and didn't want to look any further, about it being a base of freezing area that no one could get through, and there's just a lot of penguins and sheep. This is a vital military area with huge land masses, places for flying in large amount of people, for genocide, for murder, for this experimentation, for atomic research, for secret weapon bases. The intent was there to begin World War III. There was a program last week on television where the Argentines referred to their area as the fatherland. Maybe you heard it. This goes on all the time. There seems to be unlimited money. If I had the time to spend 2 weeks to add up the missing millions of articles that I've just collected and talked about on the air, where are they gone? Most of them are down in the area of South America. So if the money is there and the intent is there and the organization and the technology is there, how long will it be before various countries take sides and line up against the United States? It's been my premise that we've been a captive nation for a long, long time, and now I'll have a chance to prove it or disprove it as the weeks go on in the next weeks or months, because the behavior of Alexander Haig to the Argentinians, the major Pentagon people playing it as if we're going to favor Great Britain when we gave them the encouragement to take the steps that they're doing, is obvious to me that there's so much double dealing. This morning on ABC News, there was a broadcast, pro-Argentine or pro-British, which side do you take? And the American newscasters down there were very much Argentine, that we shouldn't interfere, that we should have it the Malvinas, we should hand them the islands. And they didn't explain the oceans and the power that goes with giving it to Argentina, and the lack of responsibility of Argentina of showing that they can govern their own people without a total fascism. And we favored them if they were, in quotes, anti-communist. That was good enough, but we can't explain their alliance with many countries. As a matter of fact, the State Department this week said that we would cut off weapons to Argentina, and they remarked on ABC this morning that we don't send them weapons, Israel sends them. France and Israel has armed Argentina with 30,000 or 40,000 people missing, and most of them labor people or Jews down there. Israel has been arming them, and that again brings up that awful area that I mistrust the Israeli government down to its rock bottom, and they are the ones that have supplied them with these weapons. So there's a intricate web of double dealing that's going on for a long time. This thing isn't going to be settled in any number of weeks at all, but a lot more things are going to surface that will recall your memory that I've talked about in the past years, and I'll call attention to them, because you'll begin to see as these power brokers shift how much power there is down there, and let's see how much weight they throw in getting Great Britain out of the way so they have control of Antarctica and of the waterways. Well, we'll go back into that next week. It'll be an ongoing project for weeks to come, but it's interesting, if not scary, to watch it unfold. Scary, I should say. It really is. But we'll watch it next week, and we'll continue with some more of that, I'm sure, next week. and other things too. Meanwhile, this is Mae Brussell. You take care of yourselves, and I'll be back with you and Carmel next week, okay?
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
KLRB, Carmel by the Sea.